Welcome to NYU NYC's 2025 project. And I'm so pleased today to be joined in this final continuing conversation that we've had in this series today. I'm Martha Stark. I'm a professor here at NYU Wagner. I'm a real lover of New York City, born and bred here, and also spent a significant number of my professional years working in New York City government. And so this project is especially near and dear to my heart. NYC 2025 convenes a bunch of nonpartisan experts across a range of areas so that we could hold an ongoing conversation about issues that must be addressed for the city to become a stronger and more equitable city than it was before COVID-19, but than it was kind of ever, is what we sort of thought about. And so this project came together basically in late 2020, December 2020, and we proceeded with it through the 2021 sort of year. What we wanted to sort of think about was get people like Scott and Joyce and Eric to offer up policy proposals that kind of could explore issues that were centered around several kind of priority areas for us. How to increase the flexibility with which New York City responds to change, how we prioritize inclusivity and equality in the city's economic growth, how we restore and boost how the city can improve the quality of life for all New Yorkers, and how we can kind of find the most efficient uses possible for the city budget and do that in an equitable and racially just way. So with that, let me just sort of tell you how we're going to proceed today. We have Joyce McMillan and Scott Levy who are going to talk to us about their paper that's entitled Family Court Justice, Miranda Rights for Families. And actually, interestingly, their topic has been in the news a little bit over the last, sort of, I'd say, couple of months, if you will. What you should know is that they're both affiliated with the Parent Legislative Action Network and a coalition that also is kind of coordinated by the Bronx Defenders. I'm going to just say a word or two about the Bronx Defenders. A public defender nonprofit, radically transforming how low-income people in the Bronx are represented in the justice system, and doing that really quite well. And by doing that, they think that, and actually are transforming the system itself. And so it was really great when we reached out to them about providing us with a policy proposal. They were only too anxious to seize that moment because in their day-to-day work, they're able to actually see how this system affects families, especially Black and Brown families in the city of New York. And so I welcome both of them to this. I'll send you some more information about what their bios included as well. Now, the second paper is actually by Eric Klinenberg. He told me not to call him Professor Klinenberg before we joined on, so I'm gonna call him Eric. And he is actually the Helen Gould Shepherd Professor of Social Science, and he's the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, which I am like really, really interested in knowing more about and going to read more about. We're all here at NYU. I'm actually a 3-time NYU person. I went here as an undergrad and also the law school, and now I'm teaching at NYU Wagner. So I'd love to kind of talk more with you about the Institute. He's an author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. And his paper is called A Social Infrastructure Plan for New York City. Now, what's interesting is several of you may be trying to sort of figure out the connection between these two papers. I mean, we have about 30 policy proposals out there that folks have written. And what I liked about these two proposals is that they talk about areas that often are overlooked by government and people without a recognition and appreciation of the vital role that these areas kind of play in people's lives. So Eric's going to talk. I'm going to start with you, Eric, if you don't mind. He'll talk about social infrastructure from the sort of vantage point, a little bit of libraries, which is certainly a not as well respected institution as it should be, given the important role that it plays. And then I will turn to Scott and Joyce to really talk about the family court system, which oftentimes just is overlooked or perhaps overshadowed as people focus more on criminal justice stuff, but don't see the ways in which the family court system affects, discourages, and can undermine kind of the social fabric of families in the city of New York. So with that, why don't I get started? You can have 10 to 12 minutes to us talk, and then I'll throw some questions your way. So why don't we start with you, Eric? Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Martha. It's really nice to be here. Although I have to say, I'm kind of done with being here on the computer. I'm really looking forward to the time when we can be together in person more regularly. It's starting to happen. I hope we stay in that state, because I think one of the things we learned about ourselves during the pandemic is that while we like the convenience of being able to avoid traffic and work from home and be the master of our own domain some of the time, we suffer quite a lot when we're just kind of in relationship with our screen, and when our relationships with other people are mediated by technology as much as they are these days. I think most of us are really longing for revitalization of collective life. I'm a sociologist by training, and one of the great sociologists that I love to read is Emil Durkheim, and he had a concept that he called collective effervescence, which is the experience you get when, and you really only get it when you're surrounded by other people, in a shared physical setting, and you experience some moment that exalts your life, that makes you feel especially alive and especially joyful. You feel it in your bones. He was a sociologist of culture and religion, and he was, in this context, writing about what happens in sacred moments in religious life. But in the modern world, we have our moments of collective effervescence when we're together in all kinds of other forums. Good basketball game, a concert, a great public policy lecture, theater, those kinds of things. And I think we really miss those occasions, for collective effervescence. And often in our policy debates, we're thinking about how do we achieve the fundamentals of social justice and decency? How do we end social problems and give people a sense of dignity and respect? And we do a lot of repair work in policy, and we seek out the baseline standard of living that we want everyone to achieve. And of course, those things should be the priority. We have big challenges in the city around housing, for instance, and employment, poverty. But I think our policy discussion should also reach higher and think about how we generate a better quality of life in general, and how we restore those good feelings that make us want to be in a city in the first place. What is it that makes New York City special? It's not really the housing that makes New York City special. It's that when you're together with other people in New York, magical things happen. And so I've been thinking about Durkheim and this idea of collective effervescence, because we haven't had a lot of it the last couple of years. And these public occasions can be forums where we do it. The idea that I pitched for my vision for New York City in 2025 is related to all of this, of course. I champion what I call a social infrastructure plan for the city. And the ideas for this come from this book that you mentioned called Palaces for the People, which is a book about the role of social infrastructure in helping us address inequality and polarization, and helping us promote civic life. And when I wrote the book, it came out in 2018. We didn't really have a conversation about social infrastructure in this country. We didn't really even have a concept of social infrastructure. So I always had to explain it, when I gave lectures. People didn't know what social infrastructure was. And of course, today it's a somewhat different story. One of the remarkable coincidences in my life is that there was this mayor from a small town in Indiana. I think it was South Bend. His name was Pete Buttigieg, and I never heard of him. But the New York Times asked him to review my book in 2018. I was very disappointed that, of all the important people in the world who could write about my book, they picked this small-time mayor from a tiny town in Indiana. I didn't know who this clown was. And so he wrote this, review, and it was all about, what social infrastructure can do. And lo and behold, today he's the Secretary of Transportation and probably has more influence on infrastructure development than anyone in the United States outside of Joe Manchin. And so we actually now have all kinds of proposals for social infrastructure that are part of the Build Back Better plan, which may or may not morph into something new, may or may not generate funding. There is a conversation about social infrastructure, and I take that to be very exciting, wonderful development. But I still think we don't have a keen sense of what it means. So I want to start by talking about the idea, and then come back to libraries and parks and other shared spaces in New York City. When I say social infrastructure, I'm referring to the physical places that shape our capacity to interact. When we invest in social infrastructure, we generate all kinds of returns to our collective life. If we have funding to build social infrastructure, if we have funds to maintain social infrastructure. I'm from Chicago originally, and I grew up in a city that had spent a lot on social infrastructures like parks and playgrounds and libraries and schools before I was born. But during the years when I was a child, Chicago had no real budget for those things, and they all fell apart. So they were in a horrible state of decline. So maintenance is a big issue. Programming, staffing are also really important. When we spend on social infrastructure and recognize its significance, we get all these incredible returns to our collective life. We become much more likely to operate like a society, to establish social bonds, to provide mutual support, to feel that feeling that makes all of political life possible, right? If city politics is about figuring out how to distribute resources and promote quality of life for different kinds of people, it really works best when people feel connected to each other and have some sense of being in a shared project. If I don't feel any social bond to the people who live in my neighborhood, let alone the people who live in another borough, I'm obviously not going to be very excited about supporting various programs. So social infrastructure is a kind of a building block for all political life. And when I say social infrastructure, I'm not using it as a metaphor. It's what I believe as a sociologist is that the infrastructure for social life is just as real as the infrastructure we rely on for water or for power, or for communications or transit. It's this kind of material substratum of physical places that make the flow of social life possible. So let me give you a really easy example of a social infrastructure that's real. Think about the playground, right? Think about the playground as a part of a city. Now, I'm not an avid reader of the Bible, I'm going to admit that here, but I read enough of the Old Testament as a kid to know that in Genesis, there's not a moment where it says, on the fourth day, God created the playground, and there were playgrounds around the earth. The playgrounds did not come from a divine force. The playgrounds were an idea, right? An idea about how to create a public space that could be a play space and a social space and a shared space where people would come together and get to know each other. Now, let's think about New York City for a moment. I'd like to ask everybody who's watching this to write down on a piece of paper your estimate of the number of relationships that exist in New York City today, because two families, a caretaker, a parent, a sibling, an uncle, an aunt, two families brought their young child to a playground. And while the kids were on the swing, the adults kind of looked at each other and checked each other out and didn't say anything. But the second or the third or the fourth or the fifth time that they went to the same playground on the same Thursday in the same neighborhood, They waved hello. They recognized each other's common humanity. Possibly even at some point, somebody needed to take a break to get on the phone, and they asked the other person to just keep an eye on their kid for 2 minutes when they moved to the other side of the playground. And the kids started playing, and the next thing, there was a lunch that people had together. They walked in the park. Maybe they went over to each other's houses, and then they introduced each other to each other's friends. A friendship emerged. It became part of a community. So ask yourself, and write this down on a piece of paper, how many relationships, how many connections do you think there are in New York City today because two families met at a playground? One of the playgrounds in New York City. What do you think that number is? Is it 8? Is it 80? Is it 80,000? Is it 800,000? Are there 8 million relationships that exist today because people in New York met each other at a playground and got to know each other? No one knows the answer to that question, obviously, but it's a massive number, right? It's a massive number of relationships that exist and would not have existed otherwise because we built these things called playgrounds, and we maintain them, right? We invested in them, we maintained them, we programmed them by putting all this equipment in there. We used to staff them, right? We used to have summer job programs for teenagers in the city that kept them, working in places like playgrounds. There was a conversation about how to staff the playground in the pandemic. And when we do that, we really activate a place and create the possibility for all kinds of mutual support, for all kinds of connections, for generating the kind of social life that makes a city work. The social infrastructure that I became the most enamored of during the time I was doing research on this book is not the playground, as much as I love the playground, but the one that I think deserves special attention and that the city should really be investing in if we want to make a better, more decent, more accessible, more equal city where more people feel a sense of belonging, is the library, the public library. The public library, I've come to believe, is an extraordinary thing, an extraordinarily rare thing. If you look at history of the human civilization, if you look at the history of cities, if you look at the state of different countries around the world today, we're blessed in the United States to be the beneficiaries of investments that people made in the beginning of the 20th century. Philanthropists, but more crucially, taxpayers who invested in a whole fleet of central and also branch libraries in this city and around the country. And this fleet of libraries is almost unmatched by any other place on earth. I think Americans don't appreciate just how generous the people who came before us here were when it came to building out this part of the social infrastructure. It's really kind of an extraordinary thing. We now have a hub in every neighborhood. Literally every neighborhood in New York City has a building. Now they're different sizes, different scale, different resources, but there is a building, a public library in every neighborhood in New York that has the capacity to provide a tremendous number of services that lift people up, that dignify them, that give them a sense of belonging in a city that can be harsh and cruel. So if you're the kind of person who thinks the library is a place where you go to check out a book, I want to tell you that is a great thing you can do at the library, and it works really well for that. But in addition, libraries in New York City provide more English as a second language instruction than any other public institution. They provide more citizenship courses for immigrants who would like to become citizens than any other institution in New York. They provide literacy courses, not just for young people who go to the library to, get a book or do a sing-along, but also for people throughout the life course. They do job training for people who are unemployed. They help people who have come out of the criminal justice system get back on their feet with all kinds of training, including for computer literacy and for jobs. They lend outfits for people who are interviewing for jobs. They provide companionship for older people. We have more old people living in New York than ever before in our city's history. We have more people living alone at risk for social isolation than ever before in our city's history. The library is a place where they can come together, not just to be with other old people, as in a senior center, but also with younger people, middle-aged people, because it turns out geriatric ghettos are not always the most desirable thing for older people. We want to be in a community. It is tremendous how many of our teenagers go to libraries in the afternoon. In fact, the busiest users of libraries, most frequent users of libraries in the United States are young people. We don't often know that. And of course, they provide free Wi-Fi access. And enormous numbers of people, more than 1 million people in New York City, do not have home broadband connections, and they rely on the library for that service. I sometimes try to think about what would have happened in New York City if we didn't have libraries during the pandemic. They closed their doors, but they provided all kinds of services remotely. They stepped up their digital offerings, courses, their more electronic offerings, curbside lending, things of that nature. And in my view, libraries could also be, as they sometimes are, but could be more reliably, resilience centers. They could be places where, when there's a crisis, when there's a blackout, when there's a hurricane, when something goes terribly wrong, the library can be and should be a safe place where people know that they are welcome, where people can get basic relief, where they can get mutual support, they can get information about what's going on, and maybe even something simple as power or heat or air conditioning or a bathroom. Now, of course, I bring all that up because these days we have created so many holes in our safety net that a lot of people who have special needs in New York City wind up in the library because it's the one place that's always open and welcoming to them. So if you do not have a home to sleep in at night, if you have a severe mental illness condition, if you have a drug addiction problem, if you're unemployed, there's a very good chance you're going to wind up in a library during the day because people are going to tell you that's the safest place you can go. And I acknowledge that that creates real obstacles and difficulties for the staff in our libraries, for the buildings and the facilities, and for other users. And so the library is a reality principle for us. It tells us who we are, but it's also doing too many things right now. So I'm going to wrap up because we've got a lot of conversation to have today. But I want to say that we have this incredible potential in every neighborhood, regardless of race or class or ethnicity or language in this city. We have incredible resource in these facilities, but to work well for the 21st century, to deal with all the kinds of demands that people place upon them, we need to make a real investment in them. We need to recognize that libraries are social infrastructure and they're also critical infrastructure. They have incredible capacity to do much more for the city, but they can't do it on a shoestring budget, and they can't do it on volunteer labor, and they can't do it without our recognition of the vital role that they can play. Until recently, well, really until today, through today, the process of funding libraries is kind of an afterthought when the city council meets. There's last minute scramble and the budget comes in just about where people hoped it did, but nowhere near what we really need. And my view is that if we want to make New York City a greater city, a more inclusive city, a more equal city, a city that dignifies all of its citizens and non-citizens as well, one of the easiest and most effective ways to do that is to fund social infrastructure, and especially to fund our libraries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. That was a great summary of your paper, and certainly an impassioned plea for the vital role that libraries play in our society. I'll talk about this later, but I actually oftentimes assign a case study in my management and leadership class that's actually on the King County library system. And one of the things the students have to do is talk about their experience with libraries and why and if libraries kind of matter to them and how. It just supports, all of what you stated, their passion, their memory of actually going into the library. And then some of our international students also, their experience not having libraries, where they were. They really paint a compelling picture of how important this form of social infrastructure is. So just wanted to sort of say that. So before I turn it over to Joyce and Scott, I did want to kind of apologize because I did not give a proper plug to JMAC for Families, which is where the organization that Joyce McMillan leads. And just, so I did put in the chat the bios for our three panelists, but what I love is JMAC for Families. If you look at their about page, it just says, we are working to abolish the current punitive child welfare system and to strengthen the systems of supports that keep families and communities together. They have a very straightforward two major goal kind of mission. Sometimes it's helpful to just keep it simple. Joyce and Scott are here to talk about, again, their paper, Family Court Justice, Miranda Rights for Families. Not sure which among the two of you you've decided is going first. I'm going to assume Joyce, but maybe I'm wrong. So Joyce, I'm going to turn it right over to you. And again, I want to thank the panelists for being here and really for their contributions to this project. Joyce. You're muted. It's so funny. We all get to this place where it feels like it's been forever, but I always forget to,
it's like, it almost feels like we're in a room together, and then you start talking and there's something that's preventing people from hearing you.
Absolutely.
But I want to say thank you for inviting myself and Scott to be here together. And I want to say thank you, Eric, for your presentation. I really actually enjoyed it very much. And while I'm here to talk about the family regulation system that I choose, and many others choose, to call the family policing system, it made me think about when you said idea, and the idea of how families come together in parks. And while we can't put a number on how many people meet in such a casual way, right? I've met families that I'm still in contact with from the playground when my children were younger. Ideas and how far they can carry, right? It was the idea to go to the park that day, that idea to introduce yourself. And then there was the idea that the government had to create systems, one of which I'm here to talk about today. What they call the family or the child welfare system, that I call the family policing and family regulation system. And just with an idea, we have generationally destroyed Black and brown families through separation. Systems separate families. Libraries bring people together. Systems separate families. Through mass incarceration, how many people have been separated by a system that has targeted certain communities? Through the family regulation system, I asked the same question. How many Black and brown families have been separated for nonsense, for reasons related to poverty that is framed to be neglect? Something that just allows them to get their grip on you. Something that keeps the idea going. Something that strengthens the idea, puts a lot of money in someone's pocket. I look at what foster care presidents make. Some of them make almost $600,000, but their children change homes every 5 to 6 months maybe, or even more frequent than that, utilizing garbage bags or pillowcases. While we continue to pour money into this system to make things better, but what does better mean and who is better by it? Because Black families are not better when they are separated. About 73,000 New York City children were subject to being investigated, having their family investigated each year in New York. 87% of those families are Black or Hispanic. 23% of children in the city are Black, but 56% of Black children were removed from their household. And what we have to consider when we think of the idea of utilizing systems as an extension of slavery is the outcome, the level of punishment, the level of torture, the lack of due process that allows us to get to that point. Hence what Scott and I are here to talk about today, Miranda rights for families, the moment that CPS, ACS, whatever you want to call them, family police, knocks on someone's door. Because if families don't know their rights and the CPS system, the ACS system has not gone to court to get a warrant or court order, whatever you want to refer to it as, to enter that person's home, then we're operating outside of oversight. We're operating in darkness. Just last week, I had a family in the Bronx, and Bronx Defenders is now defending this family, where the mom and the dad had this really loud argument. Someone called the police called ACS. ACS made one of the parents move out of the home. They also took the children out of the home and placed the child with the grandparents. But now the parent who was kicked out of the home, who has loved and taken care of their child, can't stay with their relatives because the kids are there and court orders are in place against the spouse and the children for both of the parents. This all happened without court oversight because the parent didn't know that ACS could not tell them, you got to place the kids with someone or we're going to put them in foster care. And the children and the parents, afraid of the kids who go into foster care, placed the children with the family member, and then they slapped them. Then they went to court and slapped them with orders of protection and said the children are already at a safe location. This could have looked a lot different for the family had they known their rights the moment that ACS knocked. And so ideas, the purpose of ideas, whether ideas are to help or to harm, becomes the question today, because when you mentioned idea more than one time, I just thought about the person who sat there and intertwined systems with a history of slavery. How much time I have, Martha? Are you watching your clock?
I am. You have 2 more
Okay.
minutes and then
All
we'll
right,
turn
good.
it over to Scott. You go for it. Absolutely.
Very quickly. You have a system that they claim to protect children with the most horrific outcomes that anyone can ever think of. When I worked on Wall Street, we never invested in anything that was failing. But yet with this system, we continue to pour money in it in hopes of making it better. We have a system that claims to protect children that, based on the outcomes, I would say the only thing they protect children from is success. With that being said, we have a system that's built to look just like the criminal justice system. Any system meant to protect children should in no way mimic a system that was purposely built to punish adults. They're both separated from everything and everyone they know and love. When they come into a home to investigate, they strip search children under the guise of checking for marks and bruises, even though 87% of the children, the calls were made for things related to poverty that's being framed to be neglect. They both eat what they are served. They both have set visit times on set visit days. They both have oversight during the visit period. In lieu of time, they're both paroled back to either their community or to their family. And they both have oversight during the parole period, and they can both be re-separated for any minute infraction. The outcomes for children. One of the major outcomes is over 50% of children who spend time in foster care spend more than 5 years in prison eventually. They age out of the system into homelessness, no high school diploma, teenage parents, drug addicted. What did you protect them from? What I see you doing, some people say we're pipelining children from foster care to prison. But I think the idea behind it has made it more intentional than that, because there's this loophole in the 13th Amendment that says the only way to have slaves in this country is through incarceration. So I think that foster care is a prerequisite. It's a training camp. It was done purposefully and with intention. And it is incumbent upon all of us to stop judging families for not looking like us, for not doing things the same way we do. Hey, your mom makes monkey bread and my mom make monkey bread, but we do it 2 different ways. And that carries across the board. You parent different than I. Your home looks different than I. Your income is different than mine. There's differences, and we need to respect those differences and understand how that relates to environmental differences, and not judge what people have or don't have. If we think they have less than what they should have, stop giving money to the foster mom and infuse the family with that money to ensure that they can have the things that they need, and stop punishing people for what history has created for people of color. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Scott. Thank you.
Joyce. Yeah, just amazing and compelling, stories and arguments for what needs to happen here. So thank you for that. Scott.
Thank you so much. Before I sort of jump into the family Miranda policy issue, I also just want to sort of say that, the Bronx Defenders is really a proud member of PLAN, the Parent Legislative Action Network. And that is something that Joyce has sort of been the engine behind for years. Joyce has been the most important organizer and thinker on these issues, and has really been the driving force behind the movement to reevaluate and rethink how we do the family regulation system and family court. She's also a very proud cat mom. And but we, the Bronx Defenders has been working with Joyce for years. And so I'm just very proud to be here, and wanted just to sort of put up front that PLAN and Joyce in particular have really been the driving force, not just behind the family Miranda issue, but around bringing all of these issues to light for over a number of years. So, I'll just sort of build on what Joyce was saying. I think one of the things that sort of this proposal, and I'll get into the details in just a moment, but that this proposal really asks us to do in thinking about the family regulation system and thinking about how we do family court, is starting sort of at those investigations, right? When ACS, the Administration of Children's Services, is actually initiating an investigation of a family and going into a home, questioning parents and caregivers and children, all with the implicit threat of family separation hanging in the background. Every interaction between a family, between a parent, a caregiver, and ACS, whether it's a caseworker, an attorney, anyone in that system, carries with it the implicit threat that children will be taken forcibly from their parents or their caregivers. And so I think one of the things that just as a starting place is sort of asking for a shift in the way that we think about these investigations as sort of neutral, harmless investigations, and actually deeply traumatic, as Joyce has already laid out for us, that the investigation itself of a family is a deeply traumatic experience that has, long-lasting generational effects, right, on the trust between a parent and their child, parent and their caregiver, and also that family and their neighbors, that family and their community, that family and their government, right? That investigation, whether or not it results in family separation, is itself deeply traumatic and can leave lasting scars for everybody involved. And with that in mind, the proposal in our paper really looks at that moment when that knock comes at the door, right? When the family regulation worker comes and says, we'd like to just talk to you about a call that we received, right? And with that sort of reorientation about how we think about the family regulation system and how it so clearly mirrors our system of policing, as Joyce sort of already laid out, and that even if the intention may be a good one, that the experience of the person on the other side of the door, the person who opens the door to the ACS caseworker, they experience that as surveillance, they experience that as policing, and the threat that is behind that knock at the door, right, carries with it some of the most grave and serious consequences a family can ever look at, right? This forcible separation of a parent from a child. And so acknowledging that, the sort of the gravity of that moment, and of course, and of the larger investigation, the idea that we've sort of proposed, and just sort of to say this is a proposal and a policy that we're looking at, you know, to be implemented at the city level, but also at the state level through legislation that we are working on, is to really say, we should treat that interaction for what it is, right? It is a adversarial meeting between people and their government, right? And similar to the criminal system, right, where we have Miranda rights from 1966, where when people are arrested, they are police are required to inform people of what their rights are vis-a-vis the state, right? That we should be treating those initial interactions with CPS workers, ACS workers, the same way. And one of the things that would come with family Miranda rights, so right, when there is that initial contact, one thing that is really important, I think, to sort of lay out here is that what is being proposed, what we are proposing, does not create any new rights, does not create any new legal structure. It really is just a mechanism to make sure that people know what their rights are, right? None of these are new rights. They are all pre-existing rights. And, you know, New York actually has fairly robust rules on the books to protect parents and caregivers in these situations. The problem, of course, is that many people don't know what those rights are and are never really in a meaningful position to exercise them. So I'm going to go very quickly over sort of what the list of rights is. And then, you know, probably just hand it back to Joyce or open it up for the discussion. But so these rights, as I kind of go through them, they really are pre-existing. They exist in the law. And what this really just asks is ACS to let people know, right, when they're knocking on the door. And so the first one is that people have a right to an attorney, right? You have a right to the advice of counsel, as you do, you know, in a criminal proceeding. And that I should say, as you know, the Bronx Defenders, as you know, one of the first institutional providers of representation for parents and caregivers in family courts, having access to the advice of a lawyer in that early moment can change the trajectory, right, of that interaction. So right to counsel. There's also, right, you have the right not to speak or answer questions unless there is a court order. Right now, this is different from the criminal system in that there are court orders that can be issued, right, that do require entrance to the house, you know, answering questions, but there is supposed to be judicial oversight of those moments, but that judicial oversight is bypassed on a regular basis, and parents don't know that they have the right to say, no, you need to get a court order if you want to do this. So, and also just sort of advice that what you say in these interviews with a caseworker can be used against you in a proceeding in family court, right? What you say in those interviews can come back to you in a petition to remove your children from your house or from your care. That people should be sort of advised that they can refuse entry without a court order. Now, I should say there that there are already rules on the books and very clear law that says if there's an exigent circumstance, if there's an immediate threat of harm, that you don't need a court order, you can enter a home, right? But absent sort of an immediate threat, there is a requirement for a court order that is regularly bypassed. So the Miranda rights would also require that to be part of the advice. Parents and caregivers are entitled to know what the allegations are, the nature of the allegations are. They are allowed to not permit caseworkers or ACS or CPS to interview or examine a child without a court order. One thing too that Joyce spoke about, but these interactions, these investigations, often what is happening is a stranger knocks on the door, comes in the house, separates a child from their parent, and begins questioning the child or examining the child, the body of the child, outside of the presence of the parent, which you can imagine is terrifying and traumatic for both the child and the parent. And that parents are not required to sign a HIPAA release or submit to a drug test or a mental health screening absent court oversight. Right? Often people are led to believe that they have to go submit to a drug test or they have to go submit to a mental health evaluation, and they have to sort of sign over their privacy to their sensitive health information as part of this process without understanding that they actually have legal rights in those areas. And then also they should just be provided with information about how to contact resources and counsel, right? So they should be given the number of the Bronx Defenders or of the other parent providers. And so that's sort of the universe of rights and sort of notices that we're talking about here. Given the time, and I know that we want to leave some time for sort of more of a discussion, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. One of the things I thought, similar to Joyce, Eric, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I actually thought that it was a perfect pairing for this, because as Joyce was sort of talking about, what I think everybody wants, right, is for families to be healthy and successful, children to be healthy, cared for, and successful. And what we have done is impose a system of surveillance and control rather than a system of support. And I think, Eric, what you were talking about is really about investing in infrastructures of support, right? Investing in resources that give people autonomy, that give people connection, that could give people what they need to make the decisions in their lives for themselves and for their families and for their communities, right? And that what we need is, right, support, not surveillance, right? And that, as Joyce said, when ACS comes into a house on an allegation of neglect because of really just conditions of poverty, that our response should not be to threaten removal of children from that home, but to provide robust resources and investment in that family to make sure that they have what they need to survive and thrive. So I'll leave it there, but really thank you for this conversation. And Joyce, please jump in if I missed anything. So
I would just like to add one thing. I do believe that libraries could be part of that support mechanism and playing some role as after school or any other thing that we could really think of being forward thinking, right? Because
yeah, I would suggest this, that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because families need to remain intact and libraries should exist. But one thing I want to add to what Scott said that I want some clarity around. I always say intentional because I'm not afraid to call a spade a spade. And I know it's intentional because if it wasn't intentional, you wouldn't be talking about trying to make changes for decades, while every time you think about a change, you say, but we can't do that because kids are not going to be safe. You don't remove children, or they don't remove children because they're not safe at home. They remove them because the family came under their radar for reasons related to poverty. And that's why only 13% of children in care are there for reasons related to abuse. And the abuse includes all abuse: mental, emotional, sexual, and physical, 13%. And right now there's close to 8,000 children in care in New York City alone, the 5 boroughs. So when ACS says that children are at risk, a safety risk, they're being dishonest, because when someone reports a concern about a family, let's be clear, what happens? You need to know the process. They call what's called the State Central Registry. Now, here's a person calling. Maybe you're calling, Eric, and you have a concern about a family. Now, we trust you to share your concern to keep children safe, right? That's the idea. as you're on the phone, you get a recording that says, if this is an emergency, please hang up and call 911 now. You're someone we're trusting to make a report. You don't hang up. So therefore, we have to trust that you understood it was not an emergency. You stay on the line. You get a live agent who works for the state of New York, a government employee hired specifically to take these calls and to make a determination as to what's an emergency and what's not. And they take the call and they don't deem it to be an emergency. They don't hang up and call 911 or put it down in the emergency track either. But ACS shows up 24 to 48 hours later, which is the time frame when it is a non-emergency response. And then they get to the door and they say the family willingly let them in. And this is why we don't need Miranda rights, because they needed to see the children to ensure the children were not at imminent risk. You knew they weren't because you just went through a two-pronged process and waited 2 days to show up. And the only reason the family let you in is because you were going to weaponize another government system against them, telling them, if you don't let me in this house right now, we're going to call the police on you, which is very scary. So did I submit? Did I willingly let you in? Or was I threatened and relinquished my rights out of fear? The Fourth Amendment says that no government agency can search a person's home or property or enter without a warrant or a court order of something related to that. ACS is of no exception to that rule, and they need to stop lying, saying they can't determine what's an emergency and what's not, because they have a process in place that lets them know that it's not of urgent nature. And they also say the reason why 80-something% of the children in care are there for reasons related to poverty that are framed as neglect, because they have a hard time telling what's poverty and what's neglect. If a few dollars can resolve the issue, it's clear it's not neglect. So the fact that they can't make that determination, now they're trying to say they can't make the determination of whether or not it's an emergency, just says they are clear liars. And I'm not afraid to say they're a liar. And any ACS employee, top brass employee, or whomever else, Joyce McMillan said, you are a liar if you say you don't know whether or not it is an emergency.
I think, you know, really incredibly well said, Joyce. And again, I do like this sort of idea of, you know, social infrastructures of support, not surveillance, not separation. I think that that's kind of this, you know, overarching theme here. It seems like, you know, what's great. I mean, we only have a few minutes left, but Eric unmuted himself, so I think he might have had a kind of comment on the paper. So I'm going to defer to you and let you do that. There's just so much more to sort of unpack here, including kind of, you know, if we care, what do we do and what do we do now? Because the, you know, your proposal is actually sort of modest at best. I mean, it's you know, should go without saying that people should be told this, right? And so it's certain that there are some more things that we should also be thinking about doing, and we might find those things on, you know, the JMAC website or as part of plan. But Eric, why don't I go to you, because you did unmute, so usually means you want to.
Yeah, I don't have much to add at this point. It just I just did want to say that what you know, Joyce and Scott are identifying, you know, major problems, and the fallout from that. It's not like we want to set up the libraries so that they can deal with the fallout with that. The libraries are already dealing with the fallout of all of this damage. And I think that, you know, part of what we have to recognize is that when we use the power of the state to do violence to people, which, you know, we've so often done, you know, we create damage that kind of ripples through our social systems. And most of that damage gets absorbed by, you know, people in their bodies and by families as small organizations and systems. We lose our health. We struggle in our careers, our relationships suffer, our families get broken apart, our communities suffer. But the damage also hits our institutions because they get overwhelmed with problems that they're unable to really manage adequately. And so I'm excited to know about this proposal, but also I want to say that we don't think enough about the consequences for our city of having made meager investments in the more supportive parts of the state, of the government. And we invest massively in police. We invest massively in courts. We invest massively in prisons. We invest massively in surveillance. The punitive arm of the government is muscular. It's on steroids. And what you're describing my proposal as modest because we've just accustomed ourselves with thinking that the generous giving arm of the state, the generous arm of the government should be flimsy and weak. It gets the scraps, that fall through the squeezed hand of the muscular criminal justice system. And these two things are intimately linked together. Also because if our libraries are falling apart, if our schools are falling apart, if our parks are falling apart, if our playgrounds are falling apart, if we don't have youth employment programs, right? If we fail in all these other ways, people are going to wind up in those courts because there'll be problems. And then the aftermath of the courts is that they're going to come back to the same social infrastructures that we failed to support in the first place. So we've created I guess we're out of time, but I think the reason that these two proposals are linked is because they're part of a vicious cycle. What our failures in one lead to failures in the other.
Yeah,
and,
I agree. And I did want to say, because it was a very interesting process as we kind of wrap up. So thinking about this NYC 2025 idea, and we really wanted to figure out how the city could be better post-COVID. And so we had a diverse board and sort of diverse ideas. And what was really interesting is trying to sort of answer the question of some of the board members who would say, well, what are these proposals, like the ones that we have here, have to do with the economy, right? Like, we want this to be kind of about the economy, and yes, it should be more racially just, but without a vibrant economy, the city can't do all of the sort of good things that it should be doing through, social infrastructure, through its court systems and the like. And one of the things that we've said, quite frankly, is that it's incumbent on us as a city to actually make sure that the institutions that we have, especially those institutions that have such an incredible impact on Black and Brown communities, that they are both seen as valued, right? The libraries have to be seen as valued, but also that, the family court has to be seen as fair. And if it is not perceived that way, then that influences how everyone thinks about their government, as well as whether or not they are going to sort of believe in and sort of support, what government is about. And so I think, it's kind of interesting that we're ending with these two papers. That was, I appreciate, had to reschedule because of a conflict that developed for me. But I just think that it's so vitally important that we ensure that people are aware of these issues, and that we really are working hard to try to make sure we address them. And we could start modest, and then certainly, I know from Joyce and what she's done, and Scott and you and Eric, we also have to be bold and have to find those partners who are willing to sort of be bold in terms of what we do here. So I want to thank you again for your written contribution, for spending time with us today. Again, just to close out the series, We will have these videos available on YouTube. They should be available in the next, Lori will tell us, in the next week or two. We'll make them available to you and promote them. Our plan here is to try to track whether or not proposals are being implemented, and we are actually able to realize the vision for NYC 2025 that's, you know, so eloquently written and developed in the papers and proposals that you did. And I, again, thank you so much for your contribution, and thank you for your time today. A really great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.